Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. Today's episode is part of a special mini-series for the month of Ramadan. Millions of Muslims around the world are fasting, abstaining from food and drink from dawn to dusk for 30 days as part of a month of heightened spirituality and worship. Today's guest is an uber-talented poet and spoken word artist, Taher Adel. Taher writes incredibly moving poetry exploring language, culture, identity, and his faith, Islam. I'm really excited he's my guest today and can't wait to delve into the depth and complexity of his writing and what we can take away from his words in relation to our faith and improving ourselves. Taher Adel is a British-Bahraini poet and spoken word artist. He has an MA in creative writing and poetry from the University of East Anglia in 2021. He was a poet in residence from Wales Next to the Sea in 2019. He's the author of Lost&Found and The Names. His poems have also been published in Ambit, Smoke Magazine, The New European, Gulf Daily News, Glassworks Magazine, Tedx, Poetry London Magazine, and Poetry Salzburg Review. Taher's next poetry collection is due to be published in the near future, and it is called The Divine Names. Assalamu alaikum, Taher. Thank you for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. How are you doing?
Alaikum assalam. I'm honored to be here today. I've had a listen in to a few previous episodes as well, so I'm excited to discuss all things books and poetry.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion because you are a poet and some of your poetry is absolutely stunning. But before we get into the words that you write and the work that you produce, if you could just introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do.
Without reading my own bio, so I started writing poetry over a decade ago. I was about 17, and that was kind of the beginning of my journey towards the start of college. I started to explore poetry as a medium for kind of spiritual awakening. I had a kind of on and off relationship with my faith, and I felt like I needed to connect. And the best way for me to connect at the time was through poetry. And I was also exploring different parts of my identity, my language, my mother tongue, and all that fed into the type of writing poetry that I did end up writing. So that's how my journey, pretty much began. And since then, I've taken it more seriously. 4 years ago, I took up a master's in creative writing and poetry at the University of East Anglia, and I published an initial first collection, which was just the raw, unedited versions of my earlier works. And I've kept them that way, which is a pretty strange thing to do because normally people edit their poetry to the nth degree when it comes to releasing a poetry collection. But I looked back and I could see that these were poems that I had written as a 16 and 17-year-old, and I wanted to preserve their kind of innocence. So that early collection was titled Lost and Found, and it was simply how my journey as a poet began. Kind of contained all the unedited work I had in those early days and all the different topics and themes as well. So it kind of was an amalgamation of poetry and an awakening of sorts. Since then, I refined my poetry. I released a couple of collections, The Names being an early work, poetry, English poetry in conversation with the Arabic language. And that was consequently translated into Arabic, which is a bit confusing. So it's English poetry in conversation with Arabic words, then translated back into Arabic to discuss that same topic. So it's a kind of going into a circle. So that was published by Riwayat Reads in the United Arab Emirates last year, or the end of last year. And then early this year, there was the kind of sequel to that. So that was titled The Names. The English counterpart is to be published at the end of this year. So that is the concept of, the best way to describe this book is English poetry in conversation with specific words in the Arabic language. So in my poetic undertaking, I've discovered there's about 28 words for love in the Arabic language. And in an effort to describe the etymology of the words, I discovered that each time I tried to describe these words, they became poetic verses in themselves. So that became the project. So I'd explored the names of love, the names of the moon. So there's also about 11 known words for the moon in the Arabic language, and there's more that are unknown. So I explore them in poetic form in English poetry. And this book, The Names, kind of looks at all these concepts, going as far as lions, as far as rain and wind, and all their names in Arabic. And it's all explored in English poetry. So the sequel of that work was something I called The Chosen Names, which looked at basically its personalities in the early Islamic period, and looked at the names they were called. And it's just names that were given throughout their time, names that were given by their parents, and looking at the etymology of the words in the same format that I used with the original The Names book. And that kind of inspired the divine names, which we'll hopefully be discussing today. I didn't want to preempt your introduction, but I think it all feeds into itself, right? So my fascination with the Arabic language led me to kind of take that even further. About 18 months ago, I decided to take it upon myself to say, maybe I could explore the same concept with the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because these attributes and names are so profound in depth, will make a perfect project. And it'll be an exercise to bring me closer to my creator, which was part of my main objective. And that's why I kind of start the book with that introduction, saying how I've given myself to this project, and what I've gotten back is worth so much more than what I've put in. But we could discuss that in more depth. But that kind of encapsulates my journey as a poet. Since then, in the last month, I've tried to write a novel. I've tried is the key word. So I hope that is kind of the deep pivot and trajectory I want to take my work. So I'm kind of writing this novel based in the 8th century Arabia and Persia. And it has jinn, it has Islamic concepts, it's got poetry. It's everything that I would have liked as a teenager, but as a fictional novel. So hopefully, fingers crossed, I can learn how to transition from poetry to writing a novel, which is going to be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, I've decided to go beyond my biography with that. So with that introduction of myself, so apologies about that.
No, absolutely not. That was really great. And I'm really intrigued, actually. So you talked about how poetry has been a way for you to explore like language and your own identity. Why did you gravitate towards the form of poetry? Because there's other ways to explore those things, right? You can explore in prose writing, in photography, in travel, in food. Why did you choose poetry?
So the real reason for this is not a fanciful reason. So I was 14, I think, or just about to turn 15. I was in an English GCSE class, and I was reading the English anthologies. I don't know if you could take your mind back to that era. And a lot of it was poetry that we didn't really resonate with, or we didn't really feel represented us in any sort of way, especially growing up as a kind of a Muslim child. I didn't engage with any of the poetry. In fact, I self-declared at the time that I'm not a fan of poetry at all, until one particular moment we were tasked with writing. So it was a writing exercise where we had to mimic a poet and a specific poem from the anthology and write it in our very own way, but in a similar style. And the poem that I chose was called Tichborne's Elegy. And I'm going to try getting it up. I think the best way to describe it to your listeners is probably to read it. So Tichborne's Elegy was written by a poet called Chidiock Tichborne. And Chidiock Tichborne was a Catholic. And this was about 500-600 years ago when Catholicism was outlawed in England. So any sort of rebellion or any sort of promotion of the faith would see you in London Dungeon and you'll be executed. So poor chap Chiliok Tichborne wasn't really an advocate of his faith, but he was a cousin of an activist, meaning that by association, he was sent to the dungeons to be executed. And what do you do as a poet knowing that you're going to be executed the next day? You spend the last 24 hours writing poetry. So he done what a lot of poets would probably do in their last 24 hours. I don't think I would do that. I think I'd end up crying a lot in my last 24 hours, and I'll try remembering my family and get in contact with them. I don't think I'll write poetry. I don't think I'll be in the right mindset. But kudos to Chiliok. The rumor is that he was in his dungeon on the final night, and there are some rumors that he wrote them with his own blood, as in bleeding fingers. I love that story because it sounds even more gruesome and wonderful at the same time. But there are, other rumors that he was given a quill and pen and ink to write his final kind of death notice poem. But when I read that poem in context, knowing full well that this was the last poem he'd ever written, and then the topic that he decided to discuss wasn't, anything to do with his faith, or wasn't anything to do with how vile or horrible the king was at the time. It was a discussion about the fragility of life. And I think the listeners could perhaps search it themselves and read it, but I can read it, and it will kind of express what I'm trying to say here. So the poem goes, "My prime of youth is but a frost of cares. My feast of joy is but a dish of pain. My crop of corn is but a field of tears, and all my good is but vain hope of gain. The day is past, and yet I saw no sun, and now I live, and now my life is done. My tale was heard, and yet it was not told. My fruit is fallen, and yet my leaves are green. My youth is spent, and yet I am not old. I saw the world, and yet I was not seen. My thread is cut, and yet it was not spun. And now I live, and now my life is done. I sought my death, and found it in my womb. I looked for life, and saw it was a shade. I trod the earth, and now I was but made. I trod the earth and knew it was my tomb, and now I die, and now I was but made. The glass is full, and now the glass is run, and now I live, and now my life is done." So that was the poem, and my first initial reactions to this was, wow, like, it moved me, and I don't know if it has that same impact on everybody else, but it became my touchstone poem. So that's a poem I constantly refer back to every now and then when I need a bit of inspiration. But it reminded me that a poet 500, 600 years ago can discuss something as meaningful as the fragility of life and still resonate with a child who was 14. 500 years later. And that's when I discovered firsthand the power of poetry.
Oh, I mean that's really inspiring, but also like really moving. Like you were so young and becoming increasingly frustrated with the lack of poetry that you felt that you could relate to and that resonated with you, and then you found one that also was so different to where
so old.
Life, but still spoke to you on some like deep level. Like that's really, I mean, I guess it speaks a lot of this sort of like creativity and introspection and thoughtfulness that you have always had.
I've always said a lot of us, almost all of us, have this creative energy that's dormant perhaps. Because it simply hasn't found the right mode for it. And a lot of us as well, we don't want to explore creative endeavors because we think that we have to attribute being professional with it. And I've always used the analogy of, I play football every Thursday with my friends because I simply enjoy it. I have no ambitions to be a professional footballer. I can't be a professional footballer even if I tried, but it doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it. And I think that's what saddens me about a lot of the kind of younger generation, is that they don't pursue something because they like it or resonate with it, or because it brings them peace and tranquility and offers them a therapeutic outlet. They only pursue it if they see kind of a monetary income or a career that can flourish from it. Yeah,
I agree with you. And especially, I mean, you started off by saying how poetry helped you sort of explore, like language and your own identity. And I feel like that's so important to have a way to do that, especially when you're like a member of a minority community or you're of a certain faith, like to be able to really understand who you are can help you so much in terms of just becoming confident and finding your own place and being at peace with yourself and who you are. Because especially I think young people these days face so many challenges in fitting in.
No, for sure.
If we close ourselves off to these creative outlets and avenues that allow us to explore like within ourselves, I feel like it's just such a huge shame.
And it's the perfect voice. Art is the perfect voice for somebody because it breaks boundaries, it breaks codes of conduct. It basically allows you to express yourself in a way that people outside of your culture, outside of your religious settings, outside of your country itself, can access it and appreciate the art for the art itself. And then once they've gotten to know the art, then they would like to know the artist or the writer or the poet. And then that leads into kind of an acceptance of who you are. And that's what a lot of people should understand is important about pursuing arts, because it gives you a voice through a platform that you've created, and you can meld it into your own, where you don't need to abide by the rules. You can break out of form.
And it's true, like if you look at a poem, like especially the one that you read out a little while ago, if you look at a poem, it's often very hard to picture the poet.
Yeah.
Like what you read out could have been written by a man or a woman. It could have been written by a young person or a very old person. It could have been written by, someone that's white English. It could have been written by someone in the Middle East that's like Egyptian. You know what I mean? Like, it could have been anybody.
Yeah.
I think that's what is so almost like so beautiful about it, because it's not bound by these kind of constraints that, when we know who the author is or whatever, you kind of imagine that it's going to filter through somehow into the writing and the experiences that come out. But actually, I guess because so much poetry is based on ideas and values and emotions and experiences, it is just universal. Like
it's the universality is what makes it brilliant. You're you said the right thing there, and the fact that what I've adored about poetry most is that marriage between human experiences. So the poet brings their own human experience, and then the reader brings their own human experience, and then the poem is kind of the marriage between the two. So it's not what is read, it's not what is being written, rather it's what is understood. And I think that's the magic of poetry and the magic of writing in itself. We all read a character in a book and the protagonist is described in such detail, but in our head, he's completely different to somebody else's. And that's as much detail as a writer could give. Like, that's the beauty of writing in general. It exists in the world of the imagination, and the imagination is true knowledge. Like, Einstein, I can't remember the quote, but he goes, the weight or the measure of intelligence is actually based on the measure of creativity and imagination. So that is where true kind of knowledge thrives and lives and is kind of a living being, as opposed to just numbers on a page or words on a page.
Yeah, because I think the more I think about it, especially in speaking with you right now, like the thing that poetry can really do is it puts the reader in the driving seat, because it almost doesn't matter what intention the poet had in writing those words. When you interpret it, you bring that to life. That's your interpretation. And I guess that's one of the really annoying things when you're doing GCSE English, and you're kind of told, like, this is the poem and this is the interpretation.
Yeah.
No, like, there's millions of interpretations of this.
No. That's what confused me a lot about English GCSE at the time, and that's the reason I didn't kind of pursue it in A-level and further, is because they tell you critique it and keep an open mind, but then when your critique is completely different to what the academic critique on the board by the board was, then you're docked marks. But yeah, so I suppose that feeds back to the distinction between prose and poetry as well. With poetry, there's a lot to be imagined, left to be filled, and with imagination. With prose, perhaps it's the same but less, because it's more detailed in that sense. And then you get poets that completely write cryptically as if they're Picasso's. Everything is very cryptic, and it leaves all of it to your imagination, which is a talent in itself. I try to be a kind of, I've always said, a 70-30 guy. 70% feed the reader and 30% leave it to mystery, because I think the power of mystery and wonder, that is brilliant, especially when it comes to poetry. And that also helps people that come from different backgrounds and different demographics, and their understanding and human experience are completely different. So that 30% allows that person to kind of gauge their own response to the poem. So yeah, that's why I support the kind of 70-30 model, which I created in my mind, but that's why I work with. You don't want to spoon feed the reader too much.
Absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit about maybe like the intersection or the inspiration or the connection between your writing and your faith. How has one helped the other, or has it indeed? Is there anything from your faith that has strengthened you as a poet?
Yes, and yes, and yes. I think I've always said this, I attribute the bulk of my poetry to my faith. I grew up in a Muslim household, and my parents are quite conservative in the sense that they did encourage us to read Quran at a young age, pray 5 times a day. But there was a void growing up where, because I was brought up in the West, and because my understanding was kind of aligned with what my friends were thinking like at the time, but then I'd come home and my dad would think differently and my mum would think differently, and analyze our problem through kind of this faith-centric, God-centric view, which I loved. But then I'd go back to school and that God-centric view does not exist. And I'm like trying to marry up the two. And it was like this conflicting, parts of my identity. So it was poetry that helped me marry the two. It helped me kind of, hey, let me try to understand what God means to me, what my faith means to me, but in a way that I can understand, and not in classical ways such as, Quran, dua, and prayer, which I was doing anyway. But I needed my own expression, my own conversations with God. I felt the closest to God when I was writing poems directly to God as kind of letters. And these were private moments, which a lot of them weren't, published, and a lot of them were published in my early collection, Lost and Found. It's just me grappling with my understanding of where I am, my purpose in life. So it did offer me this solace. And I felt like the more I'd done that, the more my poetry strengthened the way. And it felt like it was almost like a divine intervention, making me, seek God through poetry. So I do attribute a lot of my journey and a lot of my growth as a poet to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to the relationship that I try to foster in the form of poetry. And a lot of people see it, that I, kind of delved and moved away from just, in the early days, it was predominantly just faith-related, spiritual-related poetry. Then I've started to explore other parts of my identity, other parts of my life and relations, like, the concept of motherhood, the concept of fatherhood, the concept of love itself. So, but then I'd always kind of circle back, and I'd always make sure that for every book I publish that isn't about God, there is a book about God, because that is kind of the center, an epicenter of my growth, and it always has been. So when I did release, a collection about the names, soon there would be a collection about the divine names, and that is part of who I am, and I think who I would hopefully, inshallah, continue to be.
I love the use of poetry to explore elements of faith, and I think especially kind of when you think about being younger and growing up, because I feel like you're faced, and this probably happens throughout life actually when it comes to Islam, like you're faced with two separate things, and one is kind of like rules and regulations about what you should and shouldn't do, like how do you perform salah, and how is meat halal, and all these kind of like important rules that are there for a purpose. And we're not going to, this isn't about complaining about rules, but the rules are there. But the other side of it is these abstract, more abstract notions about the hereafter, about the expansiveness of God's mercy, the expansiveness of God's love, forgiveness, and brotherhood, and like having tawakkul, and like even concepts like trusting in Allah but tying up your camel. Like these things are really big, right? Like they're really abstract, and I feel like as you grow up you relate to them differently. But I love the fact that so much of these things, which then can help understanding some of the rules and help you become more focused or more kind of passionate about doing those things as well. But I love the fact that poetry is adding almost like an avenue in to understanding and exploring some of these things. I think that's so important, and I think that leads us nicely into talking about your book that will be coming out soon, which is dedicated to the names of Allah. So you have, it's stunning because it's a combination of art and words, but it is essentially a poem for every name of Allah. And I was really moved by it, by some of the words, and I think increasingly, I personally, in my own life, have felt such a desire to really understand who and what Allah is. And I think, especially when you're younger, you have this notion of like, okay, God is as the creator, and God is who we worship. And, everything is in God's hand, and God will reward us, but God will also punish us. And kind of as I have grown up, anyway, and maybe there'll be people listening that can relate to this, I think I have come to think about, okay, no, but let's think about that in different ways. And I guess one of the most important ways of doing that is by understanding the names of Allah. So if you could just talk about that process for you, the decision to write this specific book, and really what you've taken away, because I'm assuming you would have had to really delve into each and every name, what that was like for you.
So I think the journey started, as I explained earlier, 18 months ago, and I've always been fascinated with Arabic words, but particular names. I think names hold an incredible power over us, whether it's our names, whether it's the divine names or other names. But it reached a point where I wanted to explore, and I felt ready to explore the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to explore them beyond the classical etymology. So there was a lot of research that went into this project. So there was a lot of classical commentary from scholars centuries back to more contemporary scholars that looked at the attributes and kind of, given contemporary examples as to what they might pertain and what they might mean. My book isn't a definition, although it might be, misinterpreted into a definition. I think there's like a little disclaimer in the introduction. It's more of a poet's conversation with his Lord. It's me.
You don't actually define. You don't define any of the names. You give us the Arabic word and the English transliteration, but you don't define it. What you present is the poetry.
Yes. So what I present is kind of a conversation. And it's a brief conversation. I think the challenge for me was to keep it brief. So each name, I could have ended up writing essays and essays about each name, and that wasn't the intention behind the project. The intention is a single line or a brief or a two-liner about a name, one of the 99 names, in a way which reflected the human experience as well as the divine experience, kind of interwoven as a conversation between servant and Lord, and in my case, poet and Lord. So that was the idea behind the project. And for those that have, I'm guessing most of the listeners of your podcast probably don't follow me on poetry, but for the ones that did or do, one or two randoms, I guess, and they would have seen this journey happen over the course of 18 months. So it was more for me, more than anything else. Every other day I would post one of the names alongside the poetic line. And then eventually, there wasn't any intention for it to be a book then, but 18 months later, we finished the 99 names, and a lot of people requested to see it in print form. But I wanted to do it correctly. The first thing that came to mind is I wanted this to be a project that benefits me in this life and the hereafter, in the sense that I wanted it to become a Sadaqah Jariyah, in the sense not just because people read it and benefit. That was a motive for me, but I wanted people to benefit from it financially. So I partnered up with the Zahra Trust, which is a charity. So all proceeds will go to charity. So not only is this a project that would hopefully benefit you on a spiritual level and help you gain understanding of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also benefit orphans. So the Zahra Trust has done great works, and they've invited me, I think 2 years ago, to see the work they do across various parts of the world. And I was really impressed with that kind of work and the orphans that were benefiting and the programs they put in place. So I decided they would be the charity that I would work with alongside the publisher to make this really work.
It's just really great because there's one thing in knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has 99 names, knowing what they are and knowing what the quote-unquote definition is of them. And again, we have this issue because the names are in Arabic and we're translating in English, and do we have a full translation or not? Probably not. Like, even if you think about the word like Rahman, right?
Yeah.
Or Rahim, and we think of like, okay, well, that means mercy, or that, but does it? Like, is that really what it means? Like,
yeah, no, that's what I learned the hard way. Like, the reassuring thing, before I get to the complexity of the issue, is the reassuring thing is even those in classical Arabic have spent centuries commentating on the names, and a lot are in conflict with each other, and a lot, are simply, astounded at the fact that one name can mean so many things. Yeah. Like, I've discovered recently that, in terms of direct translation, it looks like it means one thing, but in reality, it's contextual. It means something completely different, but also means something completely different in another sense. But together, it's a name that means a single thing, which is kind of confusing to say. But especially when you look at the kind of harsher names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that on paper, they seem to be kind of, negative. In English, when you translate it, they look like negative connotations, because in English, you put words as negative and positive, and sometimes there isn't that gray area. And I think one of the names that I was struggling with in the beginning was Al-Mudil, but then you look at the commentary and you can see that this name is a protective name. So in essence, it's a positive name. So a person that kind of the same way a mother lion would protect her cubs in aggression, but that aggression is protective. So in essence, it comes from a source of good. And the word mudil is targeted at those that have ego and pride, and not just ego and pride, but ego and pride that kind of oppresses people that are disenfranchised. So when that name comes into play, Al-Mudhil, he would kind of subdue those with ego and pride that not just have ego and pride, but oppress those that are, disenfranchised by their kind of traits. So it is a positive, it's a protective thing. So even those, some people will be like, oh, I like 70 names, but the rest of the names are a bit iffy. I've had that discussion with people. I was like, no, at the end of the day, it's understanding the names. The beautiful thing about the Quran and the beautiful thing about the names of Allah is that there is so much to learn that even if you spent your life learning, you would not learn enough for you to be able to summarize what you learned, because even the summary is as complex as the work itself. And that's a beautiful thing about this work, is that it's in conversation. It chooses not to be a definition. It chooses not to be a summary. It chooses to be flowing and moving, and poetry is the best form for, like we discussed earlier, for both the reader and the writer to have this agreement that neither is right and neither is correct. So hopefully this is a work that will benefit people, whether it's on a spiritual level, more than it's benefited me. And I think the best way to describe how it's benefited me is the first line that I have in the book, which is attributed to No Name here. It says, I surrendered my pen and it returned with a remedy. I surrendered my words and they returned with your names. So when I went into this, I came in with an open mind, and I decided I'm going to dedicate all this time to exploring these names. But what I got and received out of it was profound. A deep understanding that I thought I wouldn't be able to understand previously. And also there's the added bonus of knowing that somebody purchasing this book would be providing sadaqah jariyah to an orphan supported by the Zahra Trust. So that is something that I was hoping to kind of tick all the good boxes, and if anything gets me into heaven, it'll probably be this.
Yeah, I really, the what you said about some of the names appearing more harsh.
Yeah,
it just made me think about, again, I guess, this issue that we come across with interpretation.
Yeah.
Now, you can look at 2 people or 10 people can look at the same ayah of the Quran and they can come up with different variations of what that means. But I guess what can dictate how you interpret something as well is what you put as at the core of it. And if you put at the core of it love and mercy and Allah's gentleness, and you put the importance of justice at the core of how you're viewing anything, even a name that pertains to punishment or a name that pertains to Allah hating something, right, is going to be something of love and mercy,
exactly,
and beauty. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think any poetry that is about Islam is often so gentle and so soft, because it does come from a place of love and it centers love in its approach. What do you think that we can really learn from immersing ourselves in understanding the names of Allah? Why do you think it's so important that we should do that?
Initially, when I start to immerse myself with the understanding of the names, discover, that they're a paragon. They are the peak and pinnacle of perfection. The names and attributes, they define what a perfect human being should really be. Even though they are the names of Allah, but He has humanized these names for us, in order for us to benefit us first and foremost. And they aren't just names that are designed for us to call upon, which the Quran states, to call upon His beautiful names, and each name is as beautiful as the other. But they are names that each time we call upon should remind us of how we should be. And I think that should always be a continuous journey. And what I've learned through this poetry experiment is what I write about one name one day, next week it's a different verse forms because my understanding of that name changes. And I realize it's all very fluid. Like now I'm reading back and I'm like, if I had to describe this name, I'd describe it differently. And that's why I want it to be a blueprint, because it's not there to be permanent. And that's the beauty of us. We're very temporary, and our existing, so we're temporary, kind of having a conversation with the eternal and permanent and immortal. And that's the beauty of these lines of poetry as well, because I read them now and I can see that they are based a year ago, where I was a different person. And that just kind of describes how mortal I am, in that I am ever growing and I am developing. And now my understanding is different. Now my poetry about these names are different. So I think that would be one thing that I would encourage others to do when they immerse themselves, is that their understanding shouldn't remain their understanding, and that they should have a fluid understanding of it all, that it could change. And that when you know, in 10 years time, God forbid, you go through heartbreak, those names of Rahmah would resonate harder and more powerfully. And what you see in the names of strength will be even different. So the names like Al-Mateen, you'll see them as a kind of steadfast supporter of you because of what you've gone through. And like I said, it was all based on the human experience, and the divine experience is based on who you are at that moment. And what resonates with you in that moment is completely different with what would resonate with you 5 years from now, when you're hardened in a certain way and softened in a certain way. And that is how humans are, right? So that was what I tried to introduce through the poetry, and adding a human element. Some people can almost grasp the person saying it is a human, is trying to perceive it. And sometimes the verse itself isn't human or non-human. It's a third voice. It's a person speaking as if he is neither. And that's the beauty of some of the names, because you could explore them in different first person, third person, as a person beseeching or as a person giving. So yeah, no, I thoroughly enjoyed the experiment. And it's going to be a continuous experiment, because it's not an experiment. It's a way, I see it now as not an experiment. It's a way of life. Yeah. I think we all want to accept the Quran in our life every Ramadan, maybe. But the reality is that we should accept it permanently in our life. It should be a way of life, right? And the same could be said, or should be said, for the names of Allah, and not just the ones that sound good on our tongues, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, or the ones that we memorize, the ones our parents taught us, the ones we know in mosque. There are, from I'd say the average person has memorized about 10, 15 names, if probably most likely less. They should focus on the 80 that they've ignored. And that is something that I didn't do until I was 34. And it's been the best experience of my life, just doing that. So I'm thankful that I have a book that not only I enjoyed writing, but provided me with something, like something, even though it's intangible, it's very tangible for me. Yeah. A way of understanding, a way of kind of calling on him. And isn't it beautiful to call on him in a name that you understand, or you've tried to understand, as opposed to a name that you haven't? So yeah, no, I am very grateful for that.
Well, I think, we know from the Quran that like the purpose of Ramadan is for us to gain taqwa, right? God consciousness. And I guess, the classic example is always like, well, that's to be aware of God. So if you're in a room alone and there's a plate of food, and you're fasting, you don't eat it, because although no one else is watching, God is watching, right? That's kind of like the surface level understanding of what taqwa is that no matter what happens, God is there. But actually, I think that also taqwa is understanding who Allah is, what Allah is, and our relationship with Him. Because we're told again in the Quran that Allah is the closest to us. He is closer to us than our jugular vein. But that also means that we need to take steps to embrace that closeness and to develop that level of intimacy with our Lord. And the way that you become intimate with anybody is finding out about them, right?
To know them, yeah. Like Yeah, how do we deem somebody worthy of worship if we do not know this person
Exactly.
or this being? Sorry.
Exactly. And I think that really helps us to up our game when it comes to worship, but especially when it comes to making dua.
Yeah.
When we're facing situations in life that feel impossible to deal with, or like our heart is completely broken by something devastating that's happening, or there's something that we want to happen in life and it's just not happening, I think the way that we can improve our dua and the yaqeen and the certainty that we can have in making our dua is by understanding who we are asking this thing from, and understanding that there are no barriers and limitations to Allah, but not only Allah, that there's all these different facets of who Allah is and why He's going to answer our dua.
Yeah, like you've said that beautifully, it eliminates the doubt. A lot of us, when I've seen and discussed with other people, and myself included, we have this doubt of we are seeking somebody through dua, but is it going to be accepted? But if you know who God is and they know the power and magnanimous nature of God, you would be without, a shadow of a doubt that this is possible if He decrees it. And so having that understanding, and you've said it really beautiful, I could have said it better myself, is you have to learn about your Lord until you are convinced that this person holds your affairs and can give you whatever you wish if He decrees. So that's the difference between that doubt and having no place for doubt. And I guess understanding, and one way of understanding is just like you highlighted, is understanding His names, because I've said this before, He's humanized the names for us so we could understand Him within our limited kind of capacity, through ways, 99 ways that we could attribute to Him, and through His attributes and names. So I think that is the biggest mercy given to us, is that He did not just leave Himself to be a mystery. He did, but at the same time, He said to my servant, creation as a whole, here is 99 ways for you to understand me. And that's something that people should actually question. This is a gift. What do I do with this gift? How do I approach this gift? Do I use it to call upon Him, or do I use it to understanding, or both, or all at the same time? And that was the constant thing in my mind throughout the project, is there's so much more to these names. And they're scattered throughout the Quran, they're scattered throughout, scripture, they're scattered throughout hadith. There is a purpose to them. And every time you see the Prophet cite a form of dua, the names are used in abundance. It's like a cascade of names, as if, they're ever ending. So, it's a beautiful thing.
And they just seem to know exactly which name to use depending on what the situation was. I have to think, but it just seems like when we look back at the du'as and the stories, that they just knew that this is our situation, and therefore this is the name within which we need to use to call on Allah.
I was doing my research, and one of the most powerful du'as is a du'a called du'a Joshan, which is literally translates as du'a of the shield. And what is it? It's when you read it, it's just the names of Allah from start to finish. And you can imagine that completing the names of Allah provides a shield. How powerful is that concept? That saying all the names together is a shield. And this dua was so powerful, it was used even in the Ottoman times, as a form of an actual battle shield. They used to wear it underneath their armor in the Ottoman period, and the late Abbasid period as well. So they considered it so powerful, the 99 names, that it had a tangible material effect and not just a spiritual effect. So that tells you how, the understanding of that time is kind of different to the understanding of this time. Is they believed the 99 names were all you needed. And for now, unfortunately, a lot of us don't think that's the case, or we don't see it in that light. And I'm hoping this book can shed a new light and making people understand that maybe all they've been missing is this kind of conversation with the 99 names of God.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the timing, I know you've had some delays with the book, and I actually feel like, Allah's timing is always perfect, but I think that this is actually perfect because we're at a time that where the Ramadan is leaving us, and we have, I think Ramadan itself, regardless of how much worship you are able to do, there is heightened spirituality and there's heightened awareness of Allah and a desire to be close to him and to be making dua and stuff. But for your book, I guess, because it's coming out so close to the end of Ramadan, or maybe even once Ramadan is over, it's a real tool for us to hold on to that taqwa and to continue building it, because I don't believe it's something we can perfect in 30 days, even they're the best 30 days of the year. I believe it's a work in progress.
And it could be like, when we travel to, let's say, a destination, we go to Hawaii, we pick up a fridge magnet, we bring back a memento, to remind ourselves. I would consider it something beautiful. If you've had a very good Ramadan spiritually, that there is a memento you take away with you, and this would make an ideal gift. You'll be supporting, orphans. You'll be providing a source of inspiration in your home where you could keep on a coffee table. You could go back to it. The beauty of poetry is that, and in this instance in particular, is that you don't need to start anywhere. You could open a random page and it would be, a name of Allah and an art piece and a piece of poetry all in conversation with each other. And even if you don't like my words, you can look at the, the name and the art piece. But, I that's what I wanted. I wanted a book that isn't, kept in a bookshelf and left. I wanted something that could be perhaps shared around or gifted from one family member to another. If somebody's going through something that you want, or you wanted to, give your child a spiritual uplift and an introduction into the names, they could read it. And obviously their understanding will be completely different to ours. And they might come with new kind of nuances on the names, which is a fantastic thing as well. And as I said that, I think Hailstorm or really...
honestly, that's so beautiful. And I really love the fact that this book for you is a sadaqah jariyah, and that orphans through the Zahra Trust will be benefiting from it. I think it's such a pure intention, such a great thing to do. And I really hope, may Allah accept it from you, and also then from anyone else that purchases the book with this in mind. Just as parting words, do you have any words reflecting on your journey writing the book for us as the Muslim Ummah as we leave Ramadan?
I think I've said this in another interview, is I've always said, Ramadan is a great new beginning, but somebody should have their goals and expectations in a way where it's achievable. And I hope whatever I've written can make my Ramadan achievable and the goals and objectives that I have put in place achievable. And if one name of God can get me just an inch closer to that goal, then that is, more than enough for me. And I hope the same could be said for whoever reads the book. But going back to an earlier point, don't see it as a completed thing. See it as a blueprint for how you should behave around holy names and holy scripture, and how you should accommodate them into your life, into your practice, into your creativity as well.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you.
It's an honor.
Thank you so much to Taher for such a moving and inspiring conversation. I really loved it, and I hope that you did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.